So what I'm going to talk about is the impact of hydrogen generation, or in general, as we are moving closer and closer towards hydrogen, how would that impact the grid? Whether it can help the grid, it can assist the grid, or it would lead to additional burden on the grid, right? So this is what would be the point that we would discuss in this particular lecture. So there are two aspects to today's lecture. One is grid and the other is hydrogen. So we will focus first about grid, and then we would go and talk about hydrogen. And we'll see what is the impact of hydrogen going to be on the grid. This is a little bit older data from May 2022. If you want a more recent data, you can go to, I think all of us may be already aware, but we can go to CEA website and we can get a much more recent data in terms of how our grid looks like today. So obviously our grid is, I think, one of the, I think maybe top second, third, or probably fourth, I forgot the exact number, biggest in terms of capacity globally. I think China, US are probably have bigger capacity than us, but so somewhere third or fourth is where we stand. Last year it was 402 gigawatt. This again keeps on growing every year, every month. So it would have also gone up by now, I'm sure. What sort of also has been changing, if you follow the grid capacity from last 10, 20 years, is the contribution of different sources in this installation, right? So we have about, as of now, about 50% of installed capacity is coal. 28% is renewable energy sources, and rest is large hydro, nuclear, some isolated diesel generations, gas plants, and so on. So roughly, if you see, at least at this moment, it appears that renewable energy is contributing. If you see hydro, bigger hydro, that might also be sort of clubbed with renewable possibly. At this moment, they are categorized separately because I think the bigger hydro comes under Ministry of Power, and the smaller hydro comes under MNRE, and therefore they are categorized separately. But nevertheless, hydro is a renewable source. So if you add these two percentages, it's about 40, close to 40%, right? So and which is tremendous. I think this has gone up many folds in last 2 decades, I should say. That said, the energy production is probably not gone up in renewable by the same factor, which is okay. Reason being that most of the renewable sources does not, either they do not operate 24/7 or they cannot operate 24/7, right? For instance, if it's wind or if it's sun, then usually they do not operate throughout the day, throughout the month, and so on. Sometimes you'll have wind, few seasons you'll not have wind. Sun, you will be there in the noon, but in the night there is no sun. So the utilization of these capacities is not as that well as that in case of, let's say, a conventional coal or in general, a thermal power plant, right? Where as long as you have fuel, you can keep running that plant 24/7. So the energy, although the installed capacity in terms of gigawatt has become quite considerable, the energy production or the energy contribution in the overall energy utilization from the grid is still less than the percentage of the installed capacity. But we are continuously growing, so that is the positive part of it. Renewable energy sources have already sort of become quite economical, and that is the reason significant transformation to renewable energy sources. So in terms of grid parity or the price parity with respect to the grid power is already, I think, being reached. That means the per unit electricity being generated from a solar plant is at par or cheaper than the per unit electricity that cost us from the grid. So I think they are very close, and that is the reason for economic viability of these. If you have questions, what I'll do is I'll take regular pause after a couple of slides. And then if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Let me just cover a couple of slides and I'll take a pause after that. Okay, now this is all positive. Our renewable energy installations are growing. And our grid electricity is becoming lesser and lesser polluting in that sense. We are getting green and green energy as we use it from the grid. But at the same time, there are a few challenges which are also becoming more visible. First of them is in terms of controllability. So all the installations that has happened, especially let's say focusing on solar, in the first time when we started installing solar in the grid, from the grid point of view, we were a bit not sure how would it respond. And therefore, we wanted solar inverters to only operate at unity power factor. We wanted them to behave just as unity power factor sources. And then slowly we realized that, oh, there is a need for reactive power, and then why don't we use them for reactive power? So now if you see standards are evolving and we are changing from unity power factor operation to a controllable power factor operation. This is one. So in terms of controllability of reactive power, the older installations may not have it, but the newer ones, we are trying to use that capability of a power electronic inverter which connects to the grid. Secondly, as we discussed, these renewable power cannot provide power on demand because it depends on the input power or the input source, which is intermittent in nature. If it's night, there is no sun, there is no sun. So on-demand power becomes a challenge in this scenario. Or same thing to say in other words is, which is a more popular term these days, is round-the-clock power or round-the-clock operation, which cannot happen, let's say, with a solar plant. What is certainly possible with a coal plant. So these challenges are there already, but because as of now the energy produced by renewable energy sources is still less than that by conventional plants, so the challenges are not that visible. But moving another decade in future, I think these will become much more prominent when the total production of energy from renewable sources would start dominating our overall energy mix, and therefore they need attention at this moment itself. At the same time, our overall energy demand or electricity demand is increasing. That is because of increase in industrial demands. So more and more, as we move along, more industries get set up. The older industries, which may be running on alternative fuels, slowly start shifting to electricity as the main source, reason being that it is cleaner, easier to use. Residential demand is also growing because now, since the standard of living of every house would increase, it's expected that their energy consumption would also grow up, right? So all the residential demand would also increase. Plus, we are seeing a lot of EVs coming in market now, and we expect maybe, let's say, about 30, 40, 50% of the market to be electric vehicles by 2030. So that would also put additional requirement of electricity on the grid. And in general, there is a sort of, whether you talk about industry or EVs or residents, all the fuels which were being used are slowly getting converted to electricity. So all electric sort of loads, right? So all the loads would slowly shifting to electric. And that is increasing the electricity demand. So the bottom line question is that how does hydrogen helps us solve either these challenges or the increasing demand in one way or the other, right? That is what we want to conclude at the end of today's lecture. But before we do that, a few more information for us to grasp. As we say, and from childhood, as we understand that sun is the one which has abundance power, and our earth receives enormous amount of power from the sun, and everything from plant and so on actually derives power from the sun, and that's how the earth system exists. And so there is no doubt that we could capture the power from sun for maybe a little bit of it for our electricity generation as well. Among the renewable energy installed capacity in India, again, May last year data, solar constitutes about 50% of that. And this value was practically close to zero 2 decades before. So this has actually grown significantly. The wind has also grown, but not as much as solar in our case. And these are some of the reasons which are listed on the right-hand side. So low maintenance, solar doesn't have any moving part. It's almost static. There are no gears, there are no rotors, everything is static. So it requires lesser maintenance, cost effective, even for smaller installations. So this is a major thing I see in solar. The cost per unit electricity or the cost per watt of solar panel does vary, but not significantly if you increase the scale as much as, let's say, if you're talking about a coal power plant. So if somebody wants to set up a coal power plant, hypothetically for my house, I'm not sure if that would be possible also, and if it is possible, how much of land and how much of cost it will incur. But one can install a solar plant for a house. So that way, this is additional advantage why it has grown much stronger over the years. Overall, the prices have come down. 2009 it was about $2 per watt, and it has come down to now about 30 cents. And I think now I'm assuming it's pretty much constant. It's not going down further, but that's a reasonable thing. So it's about, I think, 30 cents or so now per watt. It offers flexibility of installation. You can do it on land, you can install it on roof, you can install it on a water body as well. And we have seen in past various examples of all the three. And the point which I mentioned first, that we have abundant resources. So in terms of sun, we are not short of resources, and one can really utilize those resources to get electricity out of it. Okay, now there is a small problem with the way grid is going as of now. And let me explain it, and then I will get back to the challenges which I mentioned before. So I named this problem as sitting duck. Now, what is a sitting duck? This particular waveform, you only focus on this curve, the first curve, forget about all the other lines, only look at that first graph. This first graph represents the load of a particular area. This data I've taken for one of the locations in US, and but that's pretty much the same usually with some variations, right? So for instance, if this is an electricity load in 3 a.m. in the morning, maybe some loads are being used, such as if it's summer or something, maybe air conditioners or fans or something, but the load is not much. As you reach about 9 a.m., right, the load really picks up because all the appliances are turned on at home, all the appliances or all the offices are on, all the industries have started, and so on. And so the load sort of becomes higher. Again, load may reduce a little bit, but then it may remain almost flat during this period. But again, it shoots up in the evening when everything is operating, offices are on, homes are on, residences is on, malls are on, factories are on, and so on. So this is a usual curve, and this is usual load curve, which I'm showing here. And there may be slight variations depending on region to region on this, of course, but this is the general trend. Now, if this is the electricity load demand, and if I use solar to supply this power, and if I do install a little bit of solar, and assuming that solar will give me power maybe somewhere from 7 a.m. to, let's say, about 6 p.m. Obviously, the power will be smaller in these corners and it will be more here. And And if I keep on installing more and more solar, this overall load profile on a conventional generator shifts from the top one, starts going down, right? And if I install more and more solar, this is how it comes down. So this could be, let's say, a scenario where you have quite a lot of solar. And what it says is that at 12:30 or at 1 o'clock, the load demand would be about 12 gigawatts, right? From the conventional generation, because although the total load demand is 22, but majority of it has been taken care by solar, and therefore the conventional generation or the thermal plants have to provide about 12 gigawatts. So this is how the curve changes. And now if you look at that black curve, which I have drawn, which is the last curve, which is for 2020, that curve appears to be like a duck, and therefore this particular curve is also called as a duck curve, right? So this is also called as a duck curve, which is essentially the load minus the solar generation. All right, now let's come to the problem. The problem is, what if this duck sits? What I mean by that is as follows. As of now, this is 0, right? So this is the ground, and the duck seems to be standing on the ground. By that I mean is this part is still about 12 gigawatt above the ground. What if I keep on adding solar? If I keep on adding solar, then this curve will keep on shifting down. And obviously solar is cheaper, so I keep on adding it. But these parts remains pretty much the same because there's no solar there. So if you see, the belly of the duck will touch the bottom ground of the earth or the floor. And this is what I call when the duck is actually sitting. It appears that duck is sitting, right? The problem is if this happens, then the power requirement from conventional generation becomes close to 0. If not exactly 0, it becomes very close to 0. And in that scenario, if that happens, what it means is all the conventional power plants would be not producing any power. And therefore, their role in controlling the overall quality of the grid, ensuring its operation, would be a challenge. And that kind of situation can lead to unpredictable results. And nobody really wants to go into a situation where the overall energy production is negative. For example, if this curve tries to go a little bit below, that's even more dangerous because then the generation is more and solar generation is uncontrolled. So it just keeps on pushing power. Thermal plants are already operating at 0 limit and there is no load. So what will this excess power do? This would just disrupt the grid. It will change voltages, frequencies, and which would cause, let's say, tripping of certain sections and so on. So what if the duck sits? We don't want to know. We don't want to be in that situation. And that is what people are a bit worried about now, looking in future when we have predominant solar generation. So once we have understood the duck problem, and let me show you some examples of it as well. This is from an article which published in PV magazine, which is a load data for the solar generation. So this is the data for solar generation shown in yellow line for a particular day in Spain. This is 17/4/2022, last year in Spain. And you can see this was the point where the generation from solar was really high as compared to their national demand. So obviously Spain grid is much smaller than India grid. So although you see a lesser value here, but the percentage is quite high. So PV generation reaches a peak power of almost 13.5 gigawatts, covering up to 62.5% of the national demand. The wholesale price of electricity went from 15 per unit to about 0.4 rupees per unit. This I've converted into rupees for our understanding. And so you can see that how significant impact it can have. And obviously at that point, the solar generation needs to be curtailed by tripping off some of the solar plants. If that would not have been done, who knows, there could have been more implications of that event as well. So it's a reality. It's not that the duck will not sit. Yes, it may not be as soon for a bigger grid as ours, but for smaller grids, you are seeing it's already happening. So what is the solution? There are two solutions to it. First is if we can curtail the solar, and that is what is shown in this figure. So you disconnect some of the plants, you stop some of the inverters so that their power also goes down. That is one option, but in this case, you are not really extracting the power from those plants when they are shut down. The other alternative is to install some storage and use that excess power. You can feed it into storage, and then you can draw it in the night. So it actually solves two purposes by adding a storage. One is that you can use this power which you had to curtail here, and you can also use that energy stored to provide some power in the night or in the evening hours if needed. So with that, globally, there are a lot of solar installations which are being thought about, and demonstrations across the globe. I've put some articles here talking about Italy, another one in Europe, there's one in Canada, this one is in China, and so on. So, but you can see across the globe this is happening. The storage is being installed, predominantly batteries, but also pumped storages and so on. Okay, now with that, let's now jump to hydrogen and see if what we have seen is a problem with renewables is that they're not controllable, and we are adding storages to make them controllable. Can we use hydrogen to sort of solve the same problem which the battery is solving? The answer may be a bit surprising, but then let's still go ahead step by step and see if that is a possibility. So what are the different uses of hydrogen? This graph tells us there are four predominant categories. Hydrogen is a gas which can be used for direct combustion, right? It has good energy content to it. You can directly burn it and get energy out of it. When you would burn it, most likely it would be a clean fuel burning, so you would not have harmful gases coming out of the vehicle or the unit where you're burning it. You can use it to power cars using fuel cells, or you can use it to generate electricity using fuel cells. So you can produce direct energy from burning it, or you can produce electricity by using it in a car. The other side of use of hydrogen is it is being used as a source of energy, again, most likely using direct combustion in terms of replacing coal in a lot of steel industry, right? So in steel industry, coal is being exhaustively used, and hydrogen can replace that. That is the second broad usage of hydrogen. Third is in producing other chemicals in chemical industries, such as to produce ammonia. These are the three uses of hydrogen where we use the hydrogen and then we generate something else. Maybe we generate steel, iron, ammonia, or electricity or energy out of it. The fourth dimension of this picture is using it as a storage. That means you generate hydrogen, let's say from electricity, and then you again produce electricity from that hydrogen. So in that case, we are not using hydrogen as a fuel, but rather we are using it as a storage. The rest of the three is more about using it as a fuel. This is more about using it as a storage. So we have seen that when used as a fuel, it doesn't emit any carbon dioxide. So it's a clean fuel anyways at the point of combustion, at the point of use. And when used as storage, the advantage is that it has much higher energy density. For example, if you compare it with batteries and so on. So that means in a specific volume, let's say 1 meter cube of volume, it can pack much more energy as compared to what the batteries of the current technology can pack. And that is what is also an advantage with hydrogen. Its high packing density or high energy density. So one question which should be obvious by now is that if it has certain advantages, and in literature it has been talked about as a possible storage solution. That means, so what I mean by storage is you are producing hydrogen and then reusing it to produce electricity. That is what I meant by storage. Not the storage. What I mean is, for example, in all of these applications, you will still have a tank where you store the hydrogen, which is okay. But the storage I mean is using it as a storage of energy or replacing batteries from it. The reason I want to explore it is all of this, right? So we have seen the sitting duck, we have seen the problem with renewable energies in terms of controllability, round the clock operation. So we want storage to be integrated into the grid. And that is where I want to explore in the next few slides whether hydrogen can do that job or not. So coming to hydrogen as grid storage, can I use hydrogen as a storage in the grid? So what will it do if we use it as a storage? It will essentially replace batteries and pump storages, right? So it would replace the batteries that we are going to install. Instead of batteries, we can install these hydrogen plants and who can that act as a storage. What generally basic architecture there would be, you would have a grid, then you would have some sort of power electronics here. It will be a rectifier or an inverter. Then let's say we have an electrolyzer somewhere here. And the electrolyzer will convert electricity into hydrogen, which we can save in a tank or some other medium. And then again, whenever you have excess power from the grid, you can create hydrogen. And whenever you have less power, you can go back in this cycle. You can connect a fuel cell. You can connect another power electronic converter and you can feed power into the grid. So this is how it can behave as a storage. One can use converters, inverters, electrolyzers, fuel cell, and a tank or other mediums to store it, and hydrogen can act as a grid storage, and thus replacing batteries. The problem here is that of efficiency. So usually when we convert electricity to hydrogen using electrolyzers, they are somewhat 60 to 80% efficient. So that means the energy content in the hydrogen would be about 60 to 80% of the electrical energy that one would feed at the input of the electrolyzers. And therefore, when we are using this system as a storage, while going from grid to hydrogen, we are losing power, and while coming from hydrogen again to the electricity, we are losing power. So the round trip efficiency or the overall efficiency from electricity to electricity would be about 50%. Right, that would be about 50%, which is very low. Batteries are obviously much better. All of us understand the batteries which are there today, even the batteries which were there 10 years, 15 years, 20 years back, they were doing, I think, pretty good, about 90% or higher round trip efficiencies, right? So batteries are much better in that sense as compared to this specific way of using hydrogen as a storage substitute or a substitute to battery storages for the grid. That said, So this is a limitation with hydrogen as a storage, as a grid storage, but then there is some advantage to it as well. So if you want your storage to be there for a day or so, then I think batteries are very good. So for example, if you want to store energy during afternoon, use it in the evening, or maybe store energy today, use it tomorrow or day after tomorrow, up to a couple of days, batteries doesn't lose, they don't have that faster a self-discharge rate so that they would lose considerable amount of power in 1 or 2 days. And their conversion efficiencies are very good, so they make sense for them to be used as a grid storage. Only challenge could be that that of cost, which is high even in this case. And I think over the time, the cost of both things, both components of both the systems will come down. So that is okay. On the other hand, hydrogen could be a good storage if you really want to store energy for a longer term, because for long term, batteries would have significant self-discharge rate. So even though you charge it to 100% today, after a month, you would see that they discharge themselves, and thus you don't no longer have the same amount of energy left, and you have lost, let's say, half of the energy or whatever X percentage of the energy. So if you're thinking of storages which can store today and we can use it after a month, maybe hydrogen could be a good option. But usually, as I understand, grid storage is maybe more about maybe a day or 2 days of storage, which can be done much more efficiently by battery storages. We have talked about the other advantage of hydrogen, which was the energy density. But if you're talking about stationary storages for the grid, yes, it may be a factor. If you're talking about really huge installations, and one may need to really evaluate the size and the space requirement, because batteries may not be as efficient in terms of the space utilization, in terms of the land utilization for setting up this kind of a plant. This picture here actually shows the same thing which I just talked about. So you have excess renewable sources. You can save it in battery storage short term, or you can you can convert it into hydrogen using electrolysis process and store it in a tank, which could be a long-term storage. And then this hydrogen can be used either through fuel cell or through a conventional power plant also, just by using it as a raw fuel and produce electricity again. Battery can be obviously used using inverters and then can be produced again. The right-hand path is more suitable if it's a shorter term, couple of days kind of storage requirement, and left one become more suitable if it's a long-term, couple of months storage requirement. So few weeks to months, and the right one is, let's say, for few hours, couple of days. Good. So looks like that storage hydrogen may not really be able to substitute batteries as a storage for the grid, but nevertheless, there are certain advantages, and they may be able to contribute in their own space in terms of grid support. But they may also interact with grid in other ways as well. To put it a little bit conservatively, I just took a mean of it, which was 70%, and I thought maybe technology may be improving, people may be doing R&D, and at best it could be, let's say, 50%. But I think what you said is correct, that it could be of the order of somewhere between 30 to 40%. There'll be losses in these power converters also, although that would remain the same for battery as well. But yes, you are absolutely right. The values at moment may be less, but hoping that it would also improve as we move along. So, okay, then since we have seen hydrogen as a storage for the grid, let's see hydrogen as a load for the grid. At this moment, hydrogen is not produced too much, and what is produced is from these sources. So it is produced using natural gas, coal, right, is what we, and it is also produced as a byproduct while using fossil fuels. So for all of these three, which you see currently is majority, it's close to more than 90%, 95%, 98%, 99%, and so on, is coming directly or indirectly from the fossils. and which is what we call it as gray hydrogen, right? What we want is green hydrogen. And for that to be there, what we need to focus on is producing hydrogen either from renewables, from a chemical process, or producing hydrogen from electricity and using renewable to generate that electricity. So for instance, you can use solar PV, you can produce electricity from here, and you can use that electricity to produce then hydrogen using electrolyzers, right? So this is one way to get green hydrogen. The other way is that if you have a chemical process, let's say directly from sun or from natural products, you produce green hydrogen. It is expected, at least at the current moment, that in future majority of the green hydrogen will get produced through electricity as one of the medium. So one would produce electricity using wind, solar, other renewables, and then that electricity can be used to produce hydrogen. And as of now, it's very small percentage, but if we expect this to grow significantly in future, that becomes an additional load that behaves as an additional load or an interface to the grid. Yeah. So this is what would happen in that kind of scenario. You would still have a grid. We will have renewable generation connected and feeding power to the grid. The electrolyzer, hydrogen, and the power converter for the electrolyzer might be located at a specific place, and they would draw power from the grid to produce green hydrogen. Now, the power is indirectly coming from these renewables, but then it's not necessary that the renewable plant and the hydrogen plant has to sit at the same place. And therefore, the role of grid becomes crucial in really taking power from point A to point B in terms of infrastructure and also in terms of control, because renewable may be intermittent, it may not generate power in between, but you want hydrogen power supply to continue, and then grid may have to play the role of either giving more power or absorbing a little bit extra power. So in this sense of production of green hydrogen, whether hydrogen would act as a boon or a bane for the grid, it's a bit difficult to comment. But one thing is for sure that it would add more controllability to the grid. That can be that may create more additional challenges, or that can be used to improve the overall operation of the grid as well. I will elaborate on those aspects very soon. So the question of whether hydrogen will be a boon or a bane for the grid, we'll answer very soon. At this moment, it appears it's more of an extra work for the grid. If more and more hydrogen plants come in, it's going to be a little bit more extra effort from the grid. More so, it doesn't seem to be really helping us in terms of acting as a pure storage to the grid. Let us touch upon hydrogen as a mobility solution also. Again, looking more from the e-mobility scene. So very briefly, let's just have a look at this situation as well. So one can use hydrogen tanks in the vehicle and then use that hydrogen using fuel cell stacks to produce electricity. Obviously, you still need a battery pack because the production from the hydrogen would have ramp up, ramp down time, and you want to operate it at an optimal efficiency. So you would still need a battery pack, and then all of the basic EV architecture, which is the motor, the inverter, the DC-DC converters, everything else is required as well. So as a vehicle, if you see a hydrogen vehicle is a bit more complicated than a pure electric vehicle. Right. Moreover, if you are using gray hydrogen to run the vehicle, you may not have any tailpipe emission, but then you still have emissions, not at the back of your car, but somewhere in the power station. So using gray hydrogen doesn't make much sense. If we use green hydrogen to power these vehicles, we will produce it using electricity, then we'll convert them back to electricity. So overall low round trip efficiency, which we have already seen. Complex system because you already have all the electric drivetrain and you have to put additional components. So overall system becomes more complex. The advantage it would offer is larger range and quick charging, right? These are the two things, or rather quick refueling. And therefore, this kind of drivetrain is being explored usually for highway long range commercial vehicles. Not so much for the city drives where you don't want to drive more than 50 or 100 kilometers per day, which batteries can easily do. For highways, when you want to drive, let's say per day 500 kilometers, you don't want to take a break in between. You want your truck or bus to run continuously throughout the day. That is where the advantage of hydrogen as a mobility solution comes in. So that is again what I feel like. Obviously, we see that there are few cars which exist from quite some time from some of the manufacturers based on hydrogen, and a lot of things are being tried there. But I think for highway or commercial use, hydrogen may be a more suitable option than for personal use or for city commute and so on. Coming back to hydrogen as a load to the grid. So here we were looking at that hydrogen might create an additional workload for the grid. Is that true? Yeah, so that is true, but it can offer some certain advantages as well. What is the advantage? First of all, you can, let's say, since it's the front end is power electronics, right? You can have a controllable power factor. You can do grid support using that, right? You can do voltage support using that. Imagine there'll be so many power electronics into the grid, and you can use them to feed the reactive power and improve the quality of the grid. You can control the hydrogen production. That is, in other words, you can do load management. Now this, although is not directly acting as a storage, but because you can control this hydrogen production, you can control this plant. Whenever you have low generation, you can reduce the load from the plant. And whenever you have more sun, more sunshine, more solar, more excess energy, you can use that to produce more hydrogen. So this is not directly a storage, but indirectly acting as a balance to the renewable energy sources. So during the day, maybe they operate at higher capacity. In the night, they can still be operated if there's a hydrogen demand, but they may be operated at lower capacities also. So it can help that way also. It can help in making the grid more resilient. There are few aspects which are there. So if you see most of the current power supplies for these electrolyzers from grid, usually there is a isolation transformer of 50 hertz and followed by the AC to DC converter, which currently is usually mostly SCR based or rectifier thyristor based. And then you feed it to the electrolyzer. This is the current architecture, what majority of the electrolyzer manufacturers are providing. And the problem here is, firstly, the problem is 50 hertz transformer, which is expensive, which is heavy. Secondly, SCR or thyristor control AC/DC, where you cannot control the power factor. The input current TSD is also poor. So these problems also, as we move along, as more and more newer products will come to this space, one would be able to remove this low frequency transformer, making it much smaller and compact as well. If you see, majority of the fuel cells are very, or even the electrolyzers are very compact. So this is, I think, taken from one of the manufacturer website. You see the footprint of just less than a foot by less than a foot can give you a power of 76 kilowatt. And now just imagine 100 kilowatt of or 100 kV of transformer, how big it would be, right? So if you see electrolyzer and the fuel cell, they're generally very, very power dense systems. And therefore, there is a need to also make our rest of the system, rest of the power electronic systems and the electrical equipment as compact as possible to get an overall advantage of the technology. Yeah, this is a little bit more about that. So these are very high power dense stacks. Stack voltages may range from 60 to 100 and it may go beyond also. Usually these are high current and low voltage stacks. So they are usually much more affordable when they are higher currents and lower voltages. Few specific technical requirements while we use these electrolyzers is as follows. So first one is, now if I have let me just go back to the picture. Yeah, if I have this converter, then I can control the output voltage or I can control the current that is flowing in the output. So I can control anything to the electrolyzer. If I control the voltage or the cell voltage, you see that for a small change in voltage, the change in current is significant, right? The current becomes almost double for, let's say, 0.2 volt change or 0.3 volt change. What it means is if you are controlling the voltage and if you're not able to accurately control it, the current could be anywhere between this range. And since the hydrogen production is proportional to the current, therefore the hydrogen production may also be maybe 50% or maybe 100%. So it becomes very challenging. So usually what is recommended is to do a current control instead of voltage control in the electrolyzer power supplies. So this is also one technical aspect related to electrolyzers. The other is whenever we are feeding current into the electrolyzer, there may be an average value, but there would be a ripple. Now this ripple reduces the efficiency of the electrolyzer. So you can see in this graph, for example, if I have 30% ripple factor, which is usually considerable, the efficiency comes down from 62% to, let's say, about 60.7% or something. So you have about 1% efficiency drop just by increasing, just because of this ripple. So this is also something which again needs to be taken into account when we are doing power converter design. So there are two solutions at this moment we are working on for power supplies for electrolyzer. First one is a DC to DC converter, which will integrate directly a solar panel to the electrolyzer. So this would use solar energy, draw the maximum possible energy and feed it into the electrolyzer. So this is something which we are developing. It's a 3 kilowatt unit. Other things are okay. It does a voltage matching because electrolyzer may be at different voltage, MPPT voltages could be different. Moreover, we can do paralleling of these converters, so we can do maximum 18 kilowatt in this architecture. So second thing which we are currently working is on AC power supply for the electrolyzer, which is essentially grid, and then an AC to DC, and then the electrolyzer. In this case, unlike conventional AC to DC, we have taken care of a lot of challenges, especially in terms of output ripple, in terms of volume requirement, size requirement, and so on. So this is a 3-phase 20 kilowatt AC to DC converter. Again, modular, it can connect 6 units in parallel, so one can go up to 120 kilowatt. It can be connected to the grid on one side. It can operate at unity power factor, but at the same, if you want to control the reactive power, you can do that also, and you can control the active power also. That means it will act as a completely controllable load to the grid, making it much more healthy for the grid. There's a IoT connectivity to it, so that you can manage multiple of such units. It's an isolated topology because isolation is required between grid and electrolyzer for safety, but at the same time, it doesn't use 50 Hertz transformer. So it's overall much more compact than the conventional isolated circuits. Voltage is rated at 110 volt, but this we can also change and we can tune it based on the electrolyzer that we use. It's a silicon carbide based converter, which is again a new technology that is coming up. Hopefully we'll get time and we'll talk about it in some other lecture, which helps us reduce the overall size and volume of this converter. So this was a brief from me about grid electrolyzers and how do we connect grid with electrolyzers and how can we use electrolyzers in the grid. This is my email ID. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer it now. If you have questions later also, please feel free to write to me and I'll be happy to answer. Thank you.